They say never corner a quiet woman who runs the numbers. When my husband tossed our divorce papers onto the cold clinic table, smirking that I would never financially recover on my pathetic salary, he thought he had won, rushing off to his mistress with our so-called valuable assets. He had no idea that as my pen hit that paper, he was signing his own financial death warrant. Welcome to the most expensive lesson in arrogance. Hello, dear listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. We sincerely thank you for your continuous support, but unfortunately, because YouTube has disabled our monetization, we no longer have the budget to operate and will be forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future to transition our activities to Patreon. If you find today's story compelling, please support us by joining our Patreon to hear even better, longer, and more detailed exclusive true stories that we cannot make public on YouTube. Fully produced with multiple emotional voice actors. You can join by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description or comments of this video. Now, let us begin today's story, told from the perspective of our main character, Faith Meyer. The room smelled intensely of sterile bleach and quiet regret. The steady, rhythmic drip of the intravenous liquid falling into the plastic chamber was the absolute only sound in the space. I slowly opened my heavy eyelids, fighting against the blinding fluorescent lights overhead. It had been exactly 48 hours. 48 long hours of deep unconsciousness at a highly private, secluded neurorehabilitation clinic located in the quiet suburbs of Seattle. My physical body had simply given up. It was a severe physical breakdown, driven by total, inescapable exhaustion from relentless, soul-crushing work pressure. I lay there completely motionless. I am 36 years old. I felt the cold, stiff plastic of the hospital mattress pressing firmly against my aching spine. My skin was nearly translucent under the harsh lighting. My veins were bruised a deep, painful purple from the constant barrage of needles and blood draws. The heavy wooden door to my private room suddenly swung open. It hit the wall stopper with a sharp, aggressive thud. There was absolutely no soft, polite knock beforehand. There was no worried, loving face peeking around the corner to check on my fragile state. Julian walked directly into the sterile room. We had been married for 5 long years. He was a high-flying venture capitalist. His entire existence, his entire self-worth, was meticulously built on fleeting appearances and loud arrogance. The sharp, perfect cut of his dark blue tailored suit, the blinding gleam of his Italian leather designer shoes, the heavy, oppressive gold weight of the luxury watch resting on his left wrist. He did not come into this hospital room alone. A man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit trailed closely behind him, clutching a leather briefcase. A lawyer. Julian did not walk over to offer a warm hug. He did not pause to ask how I was feeling or if I was in pain. He did not even spare a single glance at the digital heart monitor continuously tracking my fragile, weak pulse. He stepped right up to the very edge of my hospital bed. The air in the small rooms instantly felt suffocating and heavy. He looked down at me from his towering height. His cold eyes swept critically over my pale, sickly frame lying helplessly under the thin white sheets. There was no warmth or pity in his gaze. There was only unfiltered distaste. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal papers, slamming them down onto the cold aluminum tray table positioned next to my bed. The sharp metallic slap of the paper loudly echoed in the quiet, tense room. It was a post-nuptial agreement. It was also a formal divorce petition. The 2 documents were ruthlessly bundled together like a hostile corporate merger gone completely wrong. My throat was incredibly dry. Feeling like sandpaper, I could not find the physical strength to speak. I only lay there in silence, watching his every calculated move. "I am not going to drag this out," Julian declared. His voice was brisk, devoid of any emotion. Hurried and impatient, he clearly had an expensive lunch reservation. He had important places to be and important people to impress. "I am keeping the downtown penthouse. I will take the entire luxury car collection. You get to keep your old beat-up sedan. I am leaving you with your precious freedom. You should frankly consider this an incredibly generous settlement on my part. The penthouse he spoke of so proudly was heavily mortgaged to the absolute limit. The fancy cars were all simply leased under exorbitant terms. He was arrogantly taking the flashy, hollow shells of our shared life. I felt a sudden, strange sense of profound detachment washing over my tired brain. My heart rate did not spike in panic or anger. The monitor steadily kept its rhythmic, unchanged beep. Julian leaned closer to my face. The sharp scent of his overly expensive, heavy cologne was incredibly overpowering. It made my weak stomach nauseous. He smiled down at me. It was a remarkably cold, deeply calculated, cruel smirk. He looked closely at my worn, exhausted face. He looked at my bruised, shaking hands resting quietly on the stark white hospital blanket. "You are just a tedious, low-level data analyst," he sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You only make $6,000 a month. You will never financially recover from this." He threw those harsh words at me like sharp daggers. He fully expected my fragile spirit to finally shatter into a million pieces. He confidently expected me to burst into pathetic tears. He desperately wanted the sick satisfaction of witnessing my total emotional breakdown right there in the clinic bed. He wanted me to weakly beg him to stay, to plead for his mercy. I did not shed a single solitary tear. Instead of crumbling, a sudden, incredibly sharp, cold clarity washed over my entire being. The thick fog of deep exhaustion instantly lifted from my mind. The heavy medication flowing through my veins seemed to completely stop working. I saw him with perfect clarity for the very first time in our 5 years together. I saw the pathetic, empty shell of a man I had foolishly married. I saw the utterly hollow ambition driving his every move. I saw the sad, desperate need for constant external validation. This marriage had quietly died a very long time ago. It died in the silent, lonely evenings when he completely ignored my presence. It died in the cold, distant mornings when he always chose to admire his own reflection over looking at his wife. I slowly reached out my right hand. My thin fingers trembled slightly from the intense muscle fatigue of the past 2 days. I picked up the heavy, silver metal pen his lawyer had impatiently placed on top of the legal documents. I did not bother to flip through the dense pages. I did not try to read the complex legal jargon specifically designed to trap and intimidate me. I did not care at all about the specific clauses, the hidden stipulations, or his greedy demands. I just wanted him completely out of my sight. I wanted this toxic infection surgically removed from my life. I firmly pressed the tip of the pen to the first line of the paper. I signed my name without hesitation. Once, twice, 3 times on the marked lines. The dark black ink bled slightly onto the crisp, unforgiving white pages. I dropped the heavy pen back onto the aluminum tray. It made a loud, final clatter that broke the tension in the room. I slowly closed my eyes. I turned my tired head toward the blank, unfeeling white wall. I completely dismissed his entire existence from my current reality. Julian eagerly snatched the signed papers up from the tray. I could clearly hear the arrogant rustle of his expensive tailored suit. I could distinctly hear his sharp, greedy intake of breath. It was the ugly sound of unearned victory. He let out a low, satisfied chuckle. He truly believed he had just won big. He firmly believed he had successfully stripped me of absolutely everything of value. He quickly turned on his heel. He and his silent lawyer walked briskly out of the hospital room without another word. The heavy wooden door clicked shut firmly behind them. The suffocating silence returned to the space. The intravenous liquid continued to quietly drip. I slowly opened my eyes and looked at the empty room. I was entirely alone now, and for the first time in years, I was completely, wonderfully free. The reality of the modern world is that true power is rarely loud. It is often hidden deep beneath layers of carefully constructed mundane facades. Julian always firmly believed he possessed an unparalleled eye for value. He proudly called himself a master of venture capital, a financial predator who could accurately spot a unicorn startup from a mile away. Yet, his fundamental fatal flaw was that he only truly understood the flashy aesthetics of wealth, never the quiet, complex architecture of it. He looked at my simple, unbranded clothing, my complete and total absence of a curated social media presence, and my quiet, observant demeanor, and he confidently calculated my net worth to be exactly what my standard monthly corporate paycheck stated. He was catastrophically wrong. I was never just a tedious, low-level data analyst. That was simply the easily digestible, perfectly boring title I handed out to people at cocktail parties to deliberately avoid exhausting conversations about the stock market. In the real world, the one solidly built on heavily encrypted private servers and ultra-fast, high-frequency trading floors, I am a senior data architect at Omnicore Sentinel. We are a highly classified financial intelligence firm. Our primary, highly secretive business is constructing the invisible, complex security algorithms that actively keep Wall Street from completely collapsing under the crushing weight of its own digital greed and systemic fraud. When I was 22 years old, fresh out of an Ivy League university and running entirely on black coffee and sharp ambition, I independently wrote a core predictive algorithm. It was intricately designed to instantly detect microscopic anomalies in institutional trading patterns, specifically targeting hidden, sophisticated fraudulent transactions that human eyes and standard banking software simply could not ever catch. Fully knowing the immense, industry-altering value of what I had successfully created, I flatly refused to hand the intellectual property over to a corporate employer. Instead, I patented the core mathematical logic under an anonymous corporate entity and licensed it out to several major global financial institutions. That single, elegant piece of code operates silently and flawlessly in the background of billions of daily global transactions, and every single year, without me having to write another line of code or attend a single board meeting, it generates exactly $680,000 in pure, unadulterated passive royalty income. Because I intimately understand the psychological dangers of sudden wealth and the highly predatory nature of the financial sector, I legally placed every single cent of those royalties into a completely independent, ironclad blind trust, the money compounds. It is aggressively reinvested by a third-party fiduciary, and it grows quietly in the dark, completely detached from my ordinary, everyday checking account. Julian, ironically enough, spent his entire professional career desperately hunting for exactly this kind of exponential, guaranteed passive return on investment, but he was permanently blinded by his own superficial metrics of success. To Julian, a human being's inherent value was directly and exclusively proportional to the size of the gold logo heavily stamped on their imported leather handbag. He evaluated people the exact same way he evaluated terrible startup investments, relying entirely on flashy, exaggerated pitch decks and loud, empty promises. Because I drove a sensible, reliable sedan, lived an extremely minimalist lifestyle, and flatly refused to participate in the exhausting, fake theater of high society flexing, he genuinely believed I severely lacked ambition. He stupidly confused my deliberate, strategic minimalism with financial mediocrity. In the early days of our marriage, long before the cold distance between us grew into an unbridgeable, silent chasm, I honestly tried to tell him the truth. I genuinely wanted to share the reality of my life and my resources with my husband. I clearly remember standing in the kitchen of our first small apartment. I had the highly confidential trust documents printed out and carefully placed inside a plain manila folder. I waited patiently for him to finish his takeout dinner. Julian, there is a very significant financial asset I bring to this marriage that we seriously need to discuss. I had started to say, slowly sliding the folder across the cool marble counter toward him. He did not even bother to look up from his aggressively glowing smartphone screen. He impatiently held up a single, dismissive finger. Hold on. I am dealing with a major client who actually understands how to move serious capital right now. We can talk about your little retirement savings account later. He blindly grabbed his expensive car keys and walked straight out the door to attend yet another hollow networking event. I tried again a few months later, hoping to integrate my trust into our mutual long-term estate planning. He just laughed, a short, incredibly patronizing sound, and condescendingly patted my shoulder. "Let the adults handle the real money, sweetheart. You just focus on your spreadsheets and leave the heavy lifting to me." After the third spectacularly failed attempt, I silently took the folder, walked directly into my home office, and locked it securely inside my heavy steel safe. I realized right then and there that my silence was no longer a simple matter of keeping a financial secret. It had rapidly evolved into a deliberate, necessary structural stress test of his basic character. In data architecture, you purposefully stress test a foundational system to accurately see exactly how much pressure it can bear before it catastrophically fractures. I was testing Julian's capacity for basic human respect. I desperately needed to know if he could truly value a woman who did not constantly glitter and loudly shine just to stroke his own fragile male ego. He failed that foundational test completely. He failed it years before he ever crossed paths with Sienna. Sienna was exactly the kind of highly toxic, overvalued asset Julian was always destined to acquire. She was a loud, obnoxiously aggressive cryptocurrency influencer whose entire fabricated net worth was dangerously tied to highly volatile, unregulated digital tokens and heavily sponsored social media posts. She practically dripped in rented designer labels, frequently chartered luxury yachts solely for weekend internet content creation, and spoke almost exclusively in empty financial buzzwords. To Julian's untrained, desperate eyes, she was the ultimate prize. She was shiny, she was incredibly loud, and she constantly made him feel like an untouchable titan of industry. He looked at her heavily filtered, fake online persona and saw a booming empire. He looked at the quiet, brilliant architect of a multi-million-dollar trust sitting right across his own dinner table and saw nothing but a peasant. He was a foolish man who proudly built his entire existence on the fragile, cracking surface of things. He had absolutely no idea that the very financial ground he confidently walked on, the very economic ecosystem he constantly tried to manipulate, was silently held together by the quiet, invisible work of the exact woman he had just so eagerly and brutally discarded. Exactly 2 weeks after the ink had dried on the divorce papers in that sterile clinic, Julian and Sienna threw a lavish engagement party, because in the flashy, hyper-accelerated world of new money, there is absolutely no time for appropriate mourning periods or basic human decency. You have to keep the content machine running. The event took place on a chartered luxury yacht cruising around the harbor. My phone predictably blew up with screenshots sent by well-meaning but incredibly nosy mutual friends. Sienna was aggressively live-streaming the entire evening. She wore a skin-tight, highly impractical designer dress, holding a glass of imported champagne, constantly tagging the yacht rental company for a heavily discounted rate. Her captions were incredibly predictable, filled with thinly veiled insults directed at me. She posted heavily edited photos with Julian, adding captions about how a real man needs a high-value woman by his side, heavily implying he had just successfully cut off a freeloading dead weight. The social circles we used to share buzzed with intense, whispered pity for me. They saw the devastating narrative Julian was aggressively pushing. The poor, overworked, boring ex-wife who got completely left in the dust while the brilliant venture capitalist moved on to a younger, richer, much more exciting model. I let them talk. I quietly packed up my meager personal belongings, leaving behind all the expensive, gaudy furniture Julian had chosen. I leased a small, wonderfully quiet apartment hidden away in a historic neighborhood, surrounded by old oak trees and absolute silence. It was the perfect sanctuary to physically heal and reset my nervous system. My phone would occasionally light up with direct messages from Sienna. She intentionally sent me fake apologies about the divorce, attaching pictures of the massive diamond ring Julian had just bought her. I never opened them. I never blocked her. I simply let her pathetic attempts at psychological warfare disappear entirely into the digital void. Meanwhile, Julian was riding the absolute highest high of his entire pathetic life. He genuinely believed that ambushing me in that medical facility was a stroke of ruthless corporate genius. He was absolutely convinced that forcing me to sign that property division agreement while I was physically panicked and medicated had legally guaranteed his complete financial supremacy. He had aggressively claimed the downtown penthouse. He had proudly taken the entire fleet of luxury cars. In his mind, he was the ultimate winner, having successfully stripped me of every single valuable asset we supposedly shared. Riding on this wave of extreme arrogance and his carefully curated image as a newly single, incredibly wealthy, and highly successful titan, Julian made his next major move. He used his loud reputation and aggressively leveraged the very same downtown penthouse as collateral to secure $5 million in seed funding. The venture was a premium, ultra-luxury co-working space startup specifically aimed at tech bros and crypto investors. He rented a massive commercial floor in the most expensive district of the city, ordering custom Italian furniture and installing artisan coffee bars. He was playing the part of the visionary founder to absolute perfection, burning through cash as if the well would never run dry. But there was a massive, fatal blind spot in Julian's grand architectural design, a blind spot born entirely of his refusal to ever look at the boring, tedious spreadsheets he so deeply despised. He did not realize that the magnificent assets he had so fiercely fought to steal from me were not actually assets at all. They were massive, ticking financial time bombs. They were purely liabilities masquerading as wealth. The downtown penthouse he so proudly mortgaged was originally purchased using a highly volatile adjustable-rate mortgage. When the central bank quietly raised interest rates, the monthly payments on that hollow glass box skyrocketed to catastrophic levels. The luxury cars were heavily leased under predatory terms, with severe mileage penalties, structured entirely on floating interest rates that were quickly spiraling completely out of control. I knew exactly how fragile those financial instruments were. I had meticulously reviewed the original contracts years ago and had strongly advised him against them. He had ignored me, calling me overly cautious and boring. So, when he demanded to take it all in the divorce, I did not fight him. I deliberately and strategically stepped aside, allowing him to eagerly wrap his arms around a giant, sinking anchor. He thought he had stolen a treasure chest, completely unaware that he had just volunteered to carry a crushing mountain of bad debt entirely on his own shoulders. The collapse of a financial house of cards never begins with a loud explosion. It begins with a single, highly arrogant whisper. In Julian's case, that whisper was broadcasted directly into the microphones of a highly popular, aggressively monetized financial podcast, Sienna, forever desperate for external validation and eager to position herself as the ultimate power couple matriarch, had been invited as a guest speaker, sitting in a soundproof studio wearing oversized designer headphones. She casually bragged about the immense, supposedly explosive profitability of Julian's new co-working startup. She confidently threw around wildly fabricated numbers, claiming they had secured $5 million in pure profit within their first quarter and had successfully hidden it offshore to avoid heavy taxation. She thought she was building a legendary brand. She was actually handing the Internal Revenue Service a fully loaded, smoking gun. Federal tax auditors do not care about curated Instagram feeds or flashy engagement rings. They only care about discrepancies. Within exactly 3 weeks of that podcast airing, the dreaded official letters arrived at Julian's heavily mortgaged downtown penthouse. The IRS was launching a comprehensive forensic audit of his personal finances and his newly minted corporate entities. They immediately flagged the massive, unexplained gaps between his publicly claimed revenues and his actual, heavily debt-laden bank accounts. The domino effect had officially begun, and the heavy gears of absolute ruin started turning with cold, mechanical precision. Panic is a highly destructive emotion, especially for a man who has never actually faced genuine adversity. With the federal government freezing his primary operating accounts pending a full investigation, Julian's highly leveraged startup suddenly faced an immediate, catastrophic liquidity crisis. He desperately needed massive amounts of cash just to keep the lights on and pay the exorbitant rent on his luxury commercial space. So, he turned to what he falsely believed was his ultimate safety net, the penthouse. He confidently marched into the office of a premium real estate broker, fully expecting to list the property and walk away with millions. Instead, the broker slid a recent market analysis report across the desk, looking at Julian with thinly veiled pity. The property value had violently plummeted by exactly 40% in a matter of months. A brand new city zoning ordinance had just been quietly passed, authorizing the immediate construction of a massive, heavily subsidized industrial transit hub directly across the street. The breathtaking, unobstructed waterfront views that gave the glass box its entire astronomical value were about to be permanently replaced by concrete pillars and roaring diesel trains. Even worse, because of the predatory adjustable rate mortgage he had so eagerly kept. The total principal he still owed on the loan was now vastly higher than the newly tanked market value of the home. If he sold it now, he would not make a single dime. He would actually owe the bank hundreds of thousands of dollars just to close the deal. Cornered, bleeding cash, and utterly desperate, Julian's arrogance mutated into frantic, venomous entitlement. He remembered the boring, quiet woman he had discarded in the rehabilitation clinic. He remembered that I had a steady, predictable corporate income. Under the specific spousal support laws of our state, he figured he could easily drag me back into family court, claim severe financial hardship, and aggressively demand a substantial monthly alimony check to keep himself afloat. He furiously called the exact same lawyer who had confidently followed him into my hospital room. The meeting in the lawyer's high-rise office did not go the way Julian had planned. "I want her dragged back to court immediately," Julian aggressively barked, pacing the expensive hardwood floor of the law firm. "I want a full review of her current assets. I want spousal support. She owes me. I am facing a temporary cash flow issue, and she needs to pay up." The lawyer, a man who charged $800 an hour to read fine print, sat perfectly still behind his massive mahogany desk. He slowly opened the thick physical file containing our signed divorce settlement. He put on his reading glasses and carefully traced his finger down the specific pages Julian had practically shoved down my throat while I was attached to an intravenous drip. The room grew incredibly quiet. The lawyer cleared his throat, his professional demeanor cracking slightly under the weight of sheer, undeniable incompetence. "Julian," the lawyer started, his voice completely devoid of its usual aggressive confidence. "We cannot do that. We cannot touch her." Julian stopped pacing. "What are you talking about? We were married for 5 years. The state law clearly allows for modifications in the event of catastrophic financial shifts." "The state law does," the lawyer replied, slowly turning the heavy document around so it faced his client. "But this specific contract does not. When you instructed my team to draft a completely scorched earth, ironclad agreement to protect your future startup and your supposed assets, you insisted on an absolute, permanent mutual waiver of all future financial claims." "So what?" Julian snapped impatiently. "That was to protect my money from her. By forcing her to permanently waive any and all rights to your corporate entities and intellectual property, you were legally required to sign the exact reciprocal clause," the lawyer explained, his voice growing dangerously thin. "You unknowingly signed a permanent, irrevocable waiver of all rights to any of her current or future intellectual property, corporate holdings, and specifically listed right here in subsection 4, her personal blind trusts." Julian stared blankly at the dense legal text. He did not even know what a blind trust was. "What blind trust? She is just a data analyst. She does not have a blind trust." The lawyer let out a long, heavy sigh. "I ran a standard, preliminary asset check this morning in preparation for your alimony demand. I pulled the public corporate registry. Faith Meyer is not just an analyst. She is the sole registered beneficiary of a highly protected, fully independent trust entity. Based on the most recent legally mandated public tax disclosures of that specific entity, it generates an annual passive revenue stream of exactly $680,000. And because of this exact document that you demanded she sign immediately in that clinic, you are permanently, legally barred from ever touching a single penny of it. The heavy silence that followed was absolute. Julian stood there, completely paralyzed, as the horrific reality of his own actions finally caught up to him. Had he been a decent man? Had he simply proceeded with a standard, respectful divorce proceeding and legally audited our mutual assets, he would have been legally entitled to half of everything. He would have walked away with hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for the rest of his life. Instead, his blind, suffocating arrogance and his desperate need to crush a woman while she was sick had become his own financial guillotine. He had proudly built the ultimate trap, carefully sharpened the legal spikes, and then happily jumped right into it. The absolute fastest thing in the known universe is not the speed of light. It is the astonishing, breathtaking velocity at which fake loyalty completely evaporates the very second the money finally runs dry. Sienna possessed the highly tuned, predatory survival instincts of a professional parasite. The exact moment she overheard Julian screaming frantically into his phone about frozen personal accounts and federal tax auditors, she mathematically calculated that her golden goose was entirely cooked. She did not wait around to offer any emotional support. She certainly did not offer to sell her massive diamond ring to help him strategically navigate his impending corporate bankruptcy. While Julian was aggressively pacing the hardwood floors of his rapidly depreciating penthouse, desperately yelling at automated banking systems trying to unfreeze a single credit line, Sienna quietly and efficiently packed her customized leather luggage. She meticulously raided his heavy wall safe, taking every single brick of emergency liquid cash he had stupidly hidden from the federal government. She swept his velvet-lined jewelry drawers entirely clean. She even took his precious, extremely expensive collection of imported mechanical watches, knowing she could easily fence them on the black market. By the time Julian finally walked out of his home office to tell her the terrible, crushing news about their finances, she was already sitting comfortably in the first-class cabin of a direct, 14-hour flight to Dubai, sipping complimentary vintage champagne right next to a significantly older, vastly wealthier cryptocurrency magnate. Her final goodbye to the man she claimed to love deeply was a pathetic, two-sentence digital text message blaming him entirely for ruining her highly curated, fake online brand. She left him standing there completely alone, entirely stripped of his shiny accessories, staring directly down the dark barrel of total financial annihilation. His ultra-luxury co-working space startup, the grand, sparkling monument to his massive ego, had violently slammed into a solid brick wall of economic reality. You simply cannot pay premium commercial rent with arrogant press releases, heavily filtered social media posts, or empty venture capital buzzwords. Julian was exactly 90 days delinquent on the lease for his massive, custom-designed office floor located directly in the most exclusive, hyper-expensive business district in the entire city. In the brutal, unforgiving world of commercial real estate, there is absolutely no mercy for a failing, arrogant tenant. The heavy, inevitable blow arrived via a bonded legal courier on a remarkably gloomy, rainy Tuesday morning. It was a formal, uncompromising legal notice of immediate default and total asset seizure. The property management firm had officially changed the electronic locks on the heavy glass doors of his startup overnight. By strict state commercial law, every single piece of custom Italian leather furniture, every imported artisan espresso machine, every high-end computer server, and all the proprietary hardware left inside that building was now legally frozen and officially claimed by the landlord to offset the massive, spiraling, unpaid debt. His employees were locked out on the street. His entire company was completely dead in the water. Desperation is an incredibly ugly, highly visible look on a man who has spent his entire adult life aggressively practicing a flawless mask of superiority, sweating profoundly, wearing a visibly wrinkled, expensive dark suit he had clearly slept in. Julian physically stormed into the sleek, quiet, marble-lined headquarters of the property management company. He aggressively shoved past the stunned security desk and marched directly into the executive suite. loudly demanding an immediate emergency audience with the chief executive officer. He fully expected to use his loud, domineering boardroom tactics to aggressively bully the management firm into granting him a 90-day extension. He genuinely thought he could simply charm, yell, or threaten his way right out of a legally binding commercial contract. I was not physically sitting in that room, but I absolutely did not have to be. As the sole, controlling owner of the managing trust, I received the high-definition security camera footage and the crystal-clear audio recording of the entire encounter sent directly to my secure private server the very next morning. Watching that specific video file play out on my monitor felt like finally exhaling a heavy, suffocating breath I had been holding tightly in my chest for 5 excruciatingly long years. The chief executive officer of the property firm was a remarkably calm, sharply dressed man who earned a massive, multi-million-dollar salary specifically to deal with defaulting, hysterical, entitled tenants. He sat perfectly still behind his expansive mahogany desk, his hands neatly folded over a single, thick manila folder. He simply let Julian rant, scream, and violently slam his fists against the polished wood for 10 solid minutes. Julian aggressively promised massive future returns, wildly claimed his startup was on the absolute verge of a billion-dollar corporate acquisition, and fiercely demanded they unlock his office doors immediately. "Are you even listening to a single word I am saying?" Julian finally yelled, his voice cracking violently under the immense, crushing strain of his impending ruin. "I am Julian Meyer. I manage millions of dollars. You absolutely cannot just shut my entire operation down over a temporary, minor cash flow hiccup. I demand you override this ridiculous eviction notice right now. Do you know who I am?" The executive did not blink a single time. He slowly picked up a silver pen and perfectly aligned it with the sharp edge of his desk. "Mr. Meyer, you seem to fundamentally misunderstand the core dynamic of this current situation. I am merely the appointed administrative manager. I absolutely do not have the legal authority to grant payment extensions, forgive commercial debt, or override a direct written mandate from the actual owner of this building." Julian aggressively wiped the heavy, cold sweat from his pale forehead, his panicked eyes darting frantically around the quiet, insulated room. "Then get the owner on the phone. Right now. I will talk to them myself. Tell them exactly who I am. Tell them I will personally double the required security deposit by next Friday. Just give me their direct number." "That will not be possible, nor will it be necessary," the executive replied smoothly, his tone chillingly polite and entirely devoid of empathy. "The owner is fully aware of exactly who you are. In fact, when your brokerage firm originally applied to lease our premium floor 6 months ago, my team heavily flagged your dangerously leveraged financials as an extreme financial liability. We were fully prepared to reject your application outright and deny you the space." Julian looked genuinely confused, his aggressive, threatening posture deflating slightly as the cold reality began to set in. "Then why the hell did you approve the lease?" The executive slowly reached forward. He deliberately placed the thick manila folder directly in the exact center of the polished desk. "Because the primary beneficiary of our parent trust personally intervened on your behalf. They specifically instructed us to approve your commercial lease, despite your disastrous, failing credit rating. However, they also explicitly ordered my department to strictly enforce the absolute maximum legal penalty the exact second you defaulted on your rent payments. We are merely executing their highly specific, undeniable legal directives." Julian let out a shaky, arrogant scoff, desperately trying to regain total control of the slipping narrative. "Who the hell is this owner? Some rival venture capitalist trying to crush my firm? Someone trying to steal my business model? Give me their name right now." The executive did not say another single word. He simply opened the heavy folder and slowly rotated a thick, legally notarized document so it perfectly faced Julian. It was the master deed of ownership for the entire commercial high-rise building, firmly attached to the official legal registry of the holding trust. Julian leaned forward, his hands trembling violently as he tightly gripped the edge of the desk. His heavily bloodshot eyes quickly scanned the dense legal text, desperately searching for the name of a corporate rival or a massive, faceless conglomerate. Instead, his frantic gaze slammed directly into the bold, capitalized letters printed clearly on the line designating the sole, absolute controller of the trust. Faith Meyer. The sheer, absolute horror that violently washed over Julian's face was a pure, unadulterated masterpiece of human devastation. Every single drop of blood instantly drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking exactly like a hollow, terrified ghost. His jaw slacked completely open, his mouth moving silently without producing a single, coherent sound. He stared down at my name, printed in stark black ink, realizing with crushing, undeniable clarity that the invisible, invincible titan he had just been desperately begging for mercy was the exact same woman he had gleefully left for dead in a sterile rehabilitation clinic. He had unknowingly walked his fragile, heavily indebted empire right through my front door. He had eagerly signed a legally binding commercial contract handing me total, absolute control of his physical assets. He had proudly locked himself inside an iron cage I had quietly and patiently built, funded entirely by the exact same passive income he had repeatedly and viciously mocked. The executive calmly reached across the desk and closed the folder with a sharp, final snap. Your assets will be liquidated at public auction next month to partially cover your massive outstanding debt. Mr. Meyer, building security will escort you out of my office now. The heavy, relentless rain washed over the sleek glass facade of the Omnicorp Sentinel corporate headquarters late that Thursday afternoon. The sky was a bruised, dark gray, matching the cold reality of the city streets. I walked out through the massive revolving doors into the private executive loading zone. I was no longer the frail, exhausted woman trapped under thin hospital sheets. I wore a perfectly tailored, charcoal gray designer suit that commanded immediate, unspoken authority. The severe lines of the fabric matched the quiet, absolute power I now comfortably held. Standing just beyond the heavy security perimeter, getting completely soaked by the freezing rain, was Julian. He was a spectacular, horrifying vision of total ruin. His once perfect, aggressively styled hair was plastered flat against his pale forehead. He had not shaved in days, leaving a patchy, unkempt beard on his jawline. His expensive designer suit, the very same one he had worn to aggressively intimidate property managers, was now wrinkled, soaked through, and completely ruined by the unforgiving weather. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a hollow, broken shell of a man who had finally run out of other people's money to burn. When he saw me step under the massive concrete awning, he frantically pushed past the security bollards. He practically stumbled over his own ruined leather shoes, rushing toward me with wild, desperate eyes. He stopped just a few feet away, his chest heaving. He looked like he was about to physically drop to his knees right there on the wet pavement. "Faith," he gasped, his voice trembling violently over the sound of the pouring rain. "Faith, please, you have to stop this. You have to call off the asset seizure. They are taking absolutely everything, my company, my accounts, my entire life. Please, I know I messed up. I know I made a terrible mistake. I was blind. But I still love you. We can fix this. Just please, call them off." He was desperately trying to use his old, worn-out psychological manipulation tactics. He honestly thought he could still play the charming, apologetic husband and instantly erase all the damage. I stood perfectly still. I did not feel a single drop of anger. I did not feel any petty, loud vindication. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute indifference. I looked at him the exact same way one looks at a stranger making a scene on a public sidewalk. Without breaking eye contact, I slowly reached into my leather briefcase. I bypassed the heavily encrypted data drives and the multi-million-dollar corporate contracts. I pulled out a single, small piece of paper that I had taken the time to have carefully laminated in thick plastic. I held it out to him. Julian reached out with a shaking hand and took it. He looked down. It was a copy of my old corporate pay stub, the exact same piece of paper showing a net monthly income of exactly $6,000. The very same document he had violently thrown back in my face in that sterile medical clinic when he arrogantly told me I would never financially recover. "You did not lose me because I was poor," I said. My voice was perfectly flat, completely devoid of any emotion or hesitation, cutting straight through the sound of the rain. "You lost absolutely everything because you were far too shallow to recognize a diamond when it was not placed in a bright, shiny display case. The thing you will never recover is not the money, Julian. It is the fact that you will have to live the rest of your natural life knowing exactly what you threw away." He stood completely frozen, staring blankly at the laminated paper in his trembling hands. His mouth opened slightly, but the devastating weight of his own monumental stupidity finally crushed the last remaining breath out of his lungs. He had absolutely nothing left to say. I did not wait for a response. I gracefully turned my back on him. A heavy black corporate town car silently pulled up to the curb, its headlights piercing the rainy dusk. My private driver immediately stepped out and opened the rear door for me, shielding me with a large black umbrella. I stepped inside the warm, quiet interior of the vehicle. The heavy door closed with a solid, definitive thud, permanently shutting Julian out of my world. As the car smoothly pulled away from the curb and merged into the heavy city traffic, I did not spare a single glance in the rearview mirror. My life was moving brilliantly, unstoppably forward, and there was absolutely no reason to ever look back. Thank you so much, dear listeners, for taking the time to listen to this story today. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please let us know in the comments. If you found today's story compelling, please remember that our channel will be forced to stop uploading new videos here on YouTube in the near future and will transition entirely to Patreon. Please help us keep going by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel to listen to the absolute best, longest, and most exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the Patreon QR code directly on your screen or by using the Patreon link provided in the description or the pinned comment of this video.